The Introduction to The Genius of James Thurber, Selection and Introduction by Michael J. Rosen, The Folio Society, London, 1997. In 1953, less than a month before its commencement exercises, one P. Leslie Woodbine, president of Eureka College in Eureka, Illinois, mailed James Thurber a letter offering him the honorary degree of Doctor of Letters. Thurber received and accepted several such degrees during his life, although that very weekend he was regretfully to be at yet another college accepting the very same honor. 2 weeks later, a letter from Burris Dickinson, the president of Eureka College, answered Thurber's reply, reporting that the Woodbine letter was a hoax, and I am sorry if any inconvenience to you was involved. Perhaps, indeed, the recognition by a student might mean as much to you as the degree if it had been authorized by the college. To this all too casual palliative, why Mr. Dickinson hadn't chosen to save face and honor his own little college by authorizing such a degree, no doubt escapes the reader as it does me. Thurber wrote an uncharacteristically mild reply. Recall that he once described himself to Life magazine thus: "I am in a corner without being backed there, and often come out fighting." Quote, "I don't really know the etiquette that should be followed in such a predicament as mine, but I feel that I owe you and Eureka College my sincere apologies. In my college days, we played pranks too, but not on aging blind humorists. We selected stuffed shirts. If I had been able to read the letterhead I had received, and to examine the typing and the signature, I don't think I would have been taken in. I was on the point of having my secretary reply, signing her name, Virginia Creeper, but I do not regard honor or honors as a fitting subject for kidding around. As for the name of the mythical president, it is surely not an unlikely one for the Middle West. An authentic honor was recently extended to me in a letter from an Ohio woman authentically named Mrs. Depew Head. I am a friend of a distinguished Ohioan named H. Morton Bodfish, and I'm a mild authority on a celebrated Bermudian gentleman named H. Outerbridge Horsey. As for my falling for a degree offered on such short notice, I can only report that I was offered one on the identical short notice by a Middle Western State University 3 years ago. Incidentally, I turned that one down. I am certainly glad that I did not reject the mythical one. I am afraid I do not regard this hoax as a sign of appreciation by a student. If writers my age depended on appreciation from the modern college student, we would probably languish of some kind of malnutrition. I have several times pointed out in recent years that humor is dying in America, a terrifying thing, but not a surprising one in view of the condition of the world, the plight of our species, and the fearful state of the American mind and spirit. I hate to see humor replaced by vulgarity and cruelty, but I'm afraid that's what we're in for." End quote. We are now nearly 50 years from Thurber's prediction about the state of humor. Opinions are probably mixed about the degree to which vulgarity and cruelty have become a part of contemporary humor. But one thing is clear. To judge from the proliferation of recent biographies of Thurber and new editions of his work, attention to and recognition of Thurber is anything but languishing. We are as well just past 100 years since James Thurber's birth in 1894. How perfect, and yes, how daunting, at least to me, to prepare a single testament to James Thurber's genius. As a fitting reintroduction to the humorist, here is a self-portrait concocted from excerpts of autobiographical send-offs penned at various points in his career. I have supplied a few factual landmarks amid this career, which spans 18 collections of writings and drawings, 2 books of fables, 2 memoirs, 2 perennially performed Broadway hits, and 5 children's books. To begin, Quote, James Thurber was born in Columbus, Ohio, where so many awful things happened to him, on December 8, 1894. He was unable to keep anything on his stomach until he was 7 years old, but grew to be 6 feet 1 1/4 inches tall, and to weigh 154 fully dressed for winter. End quote. He was born in the blowy uplands of Columbus, Ohio, in a district known as the Flats, which for half of the year was partially underwater, and during the rest of the time was an outcropping of live granite, rising in dry weather to a height of 200 feet. This condition led to moroseness, skepticism, jumping when shots were fired, membership in a silver cornet band, and finally a system of floating pulley baskets by means of which the Thurber family was raised up to and lowered down from the second floor of the old family homestead. In truth, Thurber's childhood did include 2 lifelong influences, his mother's uncanny and often mischievous sense of dramatic humor, and the injury to his sight sustained during a game of William Tell, in which Thurber took an arrow in the eye. Sympathetic ophthalmia eventually overtook the other eye, leaving him blind amid a burgeoning career. Owing to this, his school days began with a certain frailty and introspection, though his years at East High School blossomed with honors, the class presidency, and initial recognition of his writing and drawing abilities. Thurber's studies at the Ohio State University included some predicaments, such as botany. Instead of seeing a vivid, restless clockwork of sharply defined plant cells, Thurber saw what looks like a lot of milk. Another low point was military drill. At 11 o'clock each morning, thousands of freshmen and sophomores used to deploy over the campus, moodily creeping up on the old chemistry building. As a soldier, I was never any good at all. Once General Littlefield, who was commandant of the Cadet Corps, popped up in front of me during regimental drill and snapped, "You are the main trouble with this university." I think he meant that my type was the main trouble with the university, but he may have meant me individually. Thurber did drop out temporarily during his sophomore year for his own program of reading and movie-going, but he had met Elliot Nugent, with whom he would subsequently write The Male Animal, whose own theatrical gifts and energy redirected some of Thurber's unchanneled creativity. Thurber then began to write for the school newspaper, as well as edit the Sundial, OSU's humor magazine, and played active roles in the Strollers Dramatic Club, writing plays and songs. Without a degree, he left the university in June 1918, but I couldn't get into the Army on account of my sight, just as grandfather couldn't get in on account of his age. He applied several times, and each time he took off his coat and threatened to whip the men who said he was too old. In My Life and Hard Times, which remained on the bestseller list for most of 1945, Thurber recounted the most memorable moments of his college days spent in the Victorian structure the Thurbers rented from 1913 to 1918, which is now the Thurber House, an historic landmark, museum, and cultural center. This is the legendary house where the ghost got in, alarms were heard in the night, the bed fell on father, and electricity leaked from the empty sockets when the wall switches weren't turned off. The 5 larger-than-life limestone Thurber dogs now digging and sniffing in the Reading garden are not part of the original landmark. We added them, along with a bronze unicorn munching lilies in the garden, in the years since the house opened in 1984. The mistaken exits and entrances of my 30s have moved me several times to some thought of spending the rest of my days wandering aimlessly around the South Seas, like a character out of Conrad, silent and inscrutable. but the necessity for frequent visits to my oculist and dentist has prevented this. Nobody from Columbus has ever made a first-rate wanderer in the Conradian tradition. Some of them have been fairly good at disappearing for a few days, to turn up in a hotel in Louisville with a bad headache and no recollection of how they got there. Though Thurber lived in New York, Connecticut, Bermuda, and France, Columbus remained a wellspring for much of his best work. Columbus is a town in which almost anything is likely to happen, and in which almost everything has. In 1927, after writing his Credos and Curios columns for the Columbus Dispatch, an admixture of brief reviews, parodies, editorials, and commentary that presages his future work, a stint at the Paris edition of the Tribune, and frustrating attempts at selling humorous pieces, and settling into his first marriage to Althea Adams, with whom he conceived one daughter, he met E.B. White, who arranged a meeting with Harold Ross, the editor of a then struggling new magazine, The New Yorker. Thurber was hired as managing editor, and, so he claimed, worked his way down to writer. In collaboration with White, he published Is Sex Necessary?, a parody of the popular sex psychology books of the day. They wrote alternate chapters, and Thurber provided quick pencil sketches that White inked. It was, to be sure, E.B. White who first began to look at my drawings critically. Like the discovery of San Salvador and the discovery of Pomme Soufflée, the discovery of my art was an accident. With White's encouragement, Thurber began to submit artwork to The New Yorker, where he would publish hundreds of cartoons and spot illustrations before blindness overtook him. Dorothy Parker once wrote, "These are strange people that Mr. Thurber has turned loose upon us. They seem to fall into three classes, the playful, the defeated, and the ferocious. All of them have the outer semblance of unbaked cookies." It is curious, perhaps terrible, how Mr. Thurber has influenced the American face and physique, and some day he will surely answer for it. People didn't go about looking like that before he started drawing. Nor did cartoons themselves go about looking like that until Thurber arrived on the scene. Married now to his second wife, Helen Wismer, and ensconced in Connecticut for the most part, Thurber worked steadily, creating an enormously varied and rich canon of writing and drawings. Between 1930 and 1961, he published nearly 30 books. Many of them collected the unparalleled range of casuals featured in Talk of the Town, profiles of tennis stars and nearly forgotten public figures, parodies of literary figures of the day, pulp magazines, and current events, and scores of stories such as The Catbird Seat and The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, two of the most anthologized pieces of modern fiction. In his heyday, Thurber's cartoons appeared in galleries. Henry Matisse once said that a man named Thurber is the only good artist you have in New York. His illustrations powered advertising campaigns for Fisher Body, Bugaboo Insecticide, and the French Line cruise ships. Companies such as Bergdorf Goodman manufactured Thurber-inspired clothing and tableware, and admirers and reviewers worldwide sang Thurber's praises. On the arrival of Men, Women, and Dogs, W. Somerset Maugham wrote, "It's the perfect book to turn over while one is drinking a cocktail. The only thing against it is that it makes a cocktail seem rather wan and pale." At large, and getting larger, Thurber contributed articles widely on subjects that ranged from the international spy situation to the future of photography, from the development of the bicycle to birds' discoveries in Antarctica. Though he hardly possessed genuine familiarity with these topics, he addressed each with the borrowed tone and speech of an expert, and therein lay a style of humor that has outlasted generations of imitators. Quick to arouse, he is very hard to quiet, and people often just go away. Thurber once described himself in print, and perhaps in jest. He never listens when anybody else is talking, preferring to keep his mind a blank until they get through so he can talk. Though his last years were especially troubled with the burdens of his physical and mental condition, Thurber continued to be a vivacious raconteur, a passionate debater, and, as the occasion provided, an exasperating guest. As his friend the novelist Peter de Vries wrote, "If in his art he told the truth, in his life he told it off." Shortly before his death, Thurber did manage to write a Broadway hit, The Thurber Carnival, a theatrical review of his work directed by Burgess Meredith. For several weeks he even took the stage and acted. Despite the rounds of operations and treatments for eye problems, a near-death encounter with pneumonia, a toxic thyroid condition, a series of strokes, arteriosclerosis, and the accompanying psychological strain from these and from the alcohol in which he sought release, Thurber continued to create, becoming, so he claimed, an ear writer, prevailing upon his formidable memory, which could retain 2,000 words of prose for a later dictation session. Thurber's life baffles and irritates the biographer because of its lack of design, he pretended to write as his own biographer. One has the disturbed feeling that the man contrived to be some place without actually having gone there. And yet, wherever it is he finally did manage to go, readers everywhere have been only too glad to follow. Which brings us again to the present volume. Although I have lived, and I don't mean merely figuratively, among Thurber's stories and drawings for 15 years, and although I have ransacked, or at least read, as much of his uncollected and even unpublished material as the estate has made available, I have not, until this occasion, had to choose among the work those items that would compose a consummate volume. In 2 previous volumes of Thurber's uncollected, though for the most part published work, prose and drawings that appeared in newspapers or magazines, I attempted to restore a neglected part of his canon. Neglected, I have suggested, because his own blindness, as well as his own driven, ongoing projects, propelled him into new endeavors rather than toward any comprehensive review of previous material. Moreover, the piquancy or potency of some pieces may have seemed diminished to the author at, say, a distance of 2 or 3 decades. He once said in an interview, "I guess books of humor don't last because, like the passions, humor is a changing thing. It is likely to date because it deals in the modern idiom." But we are at a more generous distance now, some 35 years since his death in 1961. What has become clear is this: so much of James Thurber's work is, like fine wine, extraordinary both for its original creation and for its present drinkability, allowing us to appreciate both the times in which he wrote and our own time. Allowing that many favorites have been passed over in my culling, permit me to set forth a few of my criteria. Ultimately, this anthology reflects my tastes, my sense of humor, and my understanding of his canon. And so I grant the reader that these inclusions may reflect nothing more noble than prejudice, nothing more scholarly than predilection. For the sake of variety as well as coherence, I have not excerpted his 2 volumes of fables, preferring to keep them in an intact whole, not a mere selection of witty morals, but a cagey indictment of American culture as it revved its wheels before World War II and spun its wheels after, unhinged by McCarthy's campaigns. Likewise, I have left for supplementary reading the whole of his 2 plainly autobiographical excursions into biography. The Years with Ross, his memoir of the New Yorker and its editor, and the Thurber album, appreciations of family and key influences in his earlier Columbus years. Moreover, I did not allocate pages for Thurber's lively tributes to other writers or public figures, feeling that, in this limited context, Thurber should be trained almost exclusively on himself. At the other end of the spectrum, I preferred to overlook many interesting pieces that reveal Thurber at his most artfully indulgent or introspective. Both those longer works, centered on wordplay or vocabulary, and his more agitated diatribes. I declined exemplary pieces that were not utterly forthcoming but required some editorial intervention or explanation, in favor of those in which any small allusions to no longer current figures or events could either be glossed over or their meaning gleaned from the context. Confined to their original volumes are, as well, several well-known works whose deprecations regarding women, race, or certain nationalities might overwhelm such a work as this later. Can we boast more advanced state and time? Even though humor must, by its very commission, occupy those territories where we are most uncomfortable, most fidgety with the reassessments of politics, order, and privilege, at this oh-so-proud distance of half a century, such jocular attention to those somewhat assuaged topics may strike a present reader as unduly juvenile or pitiable. And yet, what benighted attitudes and bigotries will another half-century claim of our present-day humor? I wanted each included cartoon to say, as the one on page 188 literally does, touché, striking the reader with its sword of apt absurdity. Thurber's sword decapitates, yes, but bloodlessly, harmlessly, theoretically even, suggesting that humor both cuts to the quick and invites us, via our laughter's admission, into the relative safety of its spectacle. Finally, I was and am still willing to admit that my selections fall short. Thurber greatly exceeds this book, but not his shelf of books in the library. And so, rather than be resigned to this, I feel somewhat like Thurber's clairvoyant on page 160, who replies to her young client, "I can't get in touch with your uncle, but there's a horse here that wants to say hello." So here is, if not the genius of James Thurber, at least a genial thoroughbred, with which to spend the hours. It is as well a serious, tendered honor, one that I hope the great man would accept. Michael J. Rosen. That's the end. Thank you for listening, especially all the way to the end of this.